Davey. Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. I too rise to support this bill, along with my coalition colleagues, but I am also very disappointed at the lack of consultation that was done with those who are gravely and very personally impacted by this bill. So while we do support it, for the reasons I'll go through, I do call on the government to further review this bill, to talk to Donor Families Australia and to really make the amendments that will get this right. So on this side, we do acknowledge that the bill builds on the Coalition's work to encourage greater rates of organ and tissue donation in Australia. And I can also confirm, like Senator Davey, that I am a very proud organ donor, willing. While we support the intention of this bill, we still do have very significant concerns over, yet again, the Albanese Labor government's failure to properly consult and communicate these changes. These concerns were very poignantly reinforced by several submissions received by the Community Affairs Legislative Committee inquiry, most notably from Donor Families Australia, who rather inexplicably were not consulted by the government or the department in the preparation of this bill. So the Coalition, and also I in particular, acknowledge the concerns raised by Donor Families Australia as outlined in their submission, including their extreme dissatisfaction at the limited consultation, and with their view that the bill fails to address the concerns of their members and failed to properly consult with the donor community. And time again, we've seen over the last 15 or so months by this government's refusal to allow for adequate consultation, and even where there is going to be bipartisan and multi-partisan support for bills, they manage to stuff up the consultation, like with the 60-day pharmacy dispensing rule and something that we all agree on, and get the policy so wrong. So I would now like to share the words of Bruce McDowell, and in fact Bruce and Karen McDowell. Bruce is the chairman of Donor Families Australia, and I will never forget the meeting that I had with them both recently in Perth. And while their voices were not heard, I would now like to read what I received from Mr McDowell, both as the chairman of Donor Families Australia and also as a father of a donor. And he says this to me: "My name is Bruce McDowell. I'm the chairman of Donor Families Australia and, more importantly, the father of Alicia, who became a tissue donor on the 15th of September 2008. But then he said this in his letter to me, and I think this demonstrates the problem with the lack of consultation by those opposite. And he says this, he says, "I wish to advise you in providing this information about my daughter, I acknowledge that I have contravened legislation." And that is one of the saddest things, I have read and heard in a very long time, because, of course, looking across the table at both of them, talking about their daughter, and realising that they are contravening legislation. And he also provided me with a letter from the WA State Health Minister that said, "I appreciate your valid concern that risk of prosecution may prevent donor families from speaking about their deceased relatives' donation." And the failure of this government to make sure that this legislation does no harm and in fact harmonises with state and territories legislation is an indictment on those who have gone through this process. So after advising me of that, he goes on to say, "DFA is a national organisation of donor families that advocates and supports and raises awareness about organ and tissue donation. We have approximately 1,000 members and 2,900 followers on our Facebook page. We recently reached approximately 250,000 people during our Donor Heroes Night event, raising awareness of organ and tissue donation whilst honouring our donor heroes, their loved ones. We wish to bring to your attention problems with the proposed bill. As noted in my first paragraph, I am being unlawful in making my daughter's information publicly known. Why is organ and tissue donation so complex and restrictive in Australia? If my daughter had passed away under different circumstances, such as suicide or drug overdose, as parents we could say as we see fit, because there is no legislation directing otherwise. But in organ and tissue donation, we have legislation ruling what families can say and do at 2 levels of government. The optics of this bill is terrible. It shows little to no respect for grieving families who are already going through enough without being told what they can say and do. This bill directly affects donor families of deceased donors. Despite this, not one donor family was consulted in the drafting of this bill. It was in fact DFA that raised with the Organ and Tissue Authority 2 years ago that it and its Donate Life agencies were and still are contravening their respective legislations. The Commonwealth Health Department, in its submission to the Senate inquiry, acknowledged that DFA was not consulted despite being a stakeholder, and I would say despite being one of the most critically important stakeholders in this whole process. He goes on to say that DFA sought legal advice on the above-mentioned bill from the legal firm Lavin. An example of the restrictions imposed that their legal advice cited was this: these proposed amendments still do not allow authorised family members to directly publish, to disseminate or disclose information capable of identifying a deceased donor or recipient. That means individuals cannot publicly talk about their loved ones. For example, a family member could not go directly to a journalist to publish a story identifying their family member as a donor or recipient. This bill encroaches on donor families' basic human rights of freedom of speech. This draconian bill does not reflect current values of freedom of speech. Why do donor families need to be directed to 4 activities, as stated in the proposed legislation, before we feel safe about what we have said? And remember, it is what they have said about their loved one. In England, their NHS provides for donor families and recipients to meet where both parties are consenting. The meeting is controlled by the organ and tissue donation officers, which ensures it is done with the right processes in place. This provides both consenting parties the opportunity of helping with their respective challenges, and it can be seen worldwide on many stages of the benefits of the UK process. So he asks, why is the Government of Australia so eager to ensure consenting parties can't meet at all, especially as our donation consent rates are at an all-time low? He believes, and he said he thinks it is time to look at a fresh approach for the system. And he also said to me, if you want to know more about how this will affect donor families, please read the submissions from the Senate inquiry. And he concludes his letter to me saying this: when this bill comes before the Senate, please oppose it on the grounds that it is restrictive and shows little respect for families already going through the pain of losing a loved one, and it will further damage the already floundering consent rates in Australia. So for all of those reasons, it pains me to support this bill, but those on this side have chosen to support the bill because the intention is good. But as Donors Families Australia have asked of us in this chamber, please look at further amendments to the bill so that donor families can own and control their loved ones' information, which is denied in this current bill before this place. And secondly, look at further amendments so that consenting donor families and consenting recipients can be assisted by Donate Life so that they can meet where they are both consenting. And I'm almost speechless, which doesn't happen very often, but I'm almost speechless to think at why we, in this day and age, we would prevent consenting families, of donor families and recipient families, to meet and to share the information about their loved ones where they are consenting to do so. So, in conclusion, we know on this side of the chamber that the topic of organ donation isn't an emotional one, and it is an important one. And I would like to very much thank the families of organ donors and recipients for their submissions. I'd like to finish up on the word of somebody else who made a submission to this inquiry, and it was a Mr Brian Myerson, OAM, and he expressed his frustration with this bill's apparent regard for donor recipients and their families, so the other side of the coin. And he said this about this bill. He said, "The bill continues to deny the rights and liberties of donor families and organ transplant recipients. These two groups have endured incredible hardships and suffering through sickness and death, and they are being denied the opportunity to divulge information about themselves and also their loved ones as and when they wish. No liberal democracy should discriminate against these groups and should protect their basic rights, such as freedom of assembly and freedom of speech." And I'll finish off by reminding you of what Mr Bruce McDowell said to me in his letter. "I'm the chairman of Donor Families Australia, and more importantly, I and his wife Karen are the parents of Alicia, who became a tissue donor on the 15th of September 2008. And he had to say this to me: 'I wish to advise you in providing this information about my daughter. I acknowledge that I have contravened legislation.' And I think it is an indictment on those who have rushed through this bill that it has been so poorly consulted, it hasn't been harmonised with state and territory legislation, and that grieving parents, but parents who are so proud that their child has been a tissue donor, it is illegal for them to have talked about their loved one in this way. So while I and those on this side support this bill, I implore those opposite to listen to the words of organ donor families and the McDowells and the thousands of others and make further legislative changes to this legislation so that no parent or family member has to say ever again that by talking about my loved one, I am contravening legislation of this nation.